It is an honor to have Randy back again for another Raising the Bar event as he shares his presentation on buyer representation. Build trust, not discuss. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you, Nancy. I gave you some tongue twisters in there, but you did a great job. So for everybody else, here's the good news. You're not going to be looking at my head for the next hour. This is actually a presentation, so I'm going to segue off here. The only thing I'm going to ask is that since I'm not going to be able to see you because the PowerPoint's going to be on the screen, is that within the time that we're here, if you have an opportunity to grab a piece of paper to take some notes on, that'd be great. There's some suggestions, some tips, some ideas that as we go through this fast-paced presentation, you might not be able to recall, so you might just want to jot them down. And then also, if you've got a scrap, just if you can grab any piece of paper you got floating around, an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, it doesn't matter if it's got printing on the back, if it's blank, if it's whatever. But if you got one available to you, because we're going to do something with it in terms of an activity. But right now, what I'm going to do is get us started on the presentation itself. So, as Nancy mentioned, this is a presentation on buyer representation about building trust, not disgust. And when we say disgust, well, is it D-I-S-C-U-S-S-E-D, disgust? No, that's something we're going to talk about in terms of how important it is to discuss things. But we're talking about disgust in the sense that what we're talking about here is disgust, the emotional aspect, D-I-S-G-U-S-T. So I've got a couple of things here. My name is Randy Templeman. I've been a longtime instructor, teaching for over 40 years. I'm always looking at bringing new material, and you're actually looking at content that has not been seen or shared with anybody previously to this day. And for those of you who are watching the recording, thank you very much for clicking on and taking the time to watch. So one of the things that we look at in this title, buyer representation, build trust, not disgust. There's a bunch of building blocks that we can put here that can get us to a level of professionalism. That's what raising the bar is all about, is increasing our professionalism. This isn't a catch-all class that's going to turn you into superstar buyer reps. It does help you in your relationships, and we're going to build on that. You've got additional raising the bars. There's additional courses that you can take. So in this Raising the Bar 2024, when we look at that concept of that title, we go back to the days of the Olympics or track and field events, and we have the high jump. And if somebody could jump over that bar, well, then they would raise it just a little bit more to challenge them to see if they could get a little bit higher. They also did the same thing with a pole vault. If somebody could jump over that bar, they would raise it up just a little bit to see if they could get a little bit further. And so that's what we are as professionals in our industry, is constantly raising the bar. The one thing, though, is that I commend you for being here or watching this video, because not everybody availed themselves of that opportunity. And this is a challenge that we have within our industry, is that so many people miss out on some really good material here. So this concept of buyer representation, build trust, not disgust, we're going to focus on the building trust part. So in that element here, we need to have a conversation. What is trust? And so trust, by its definition from the dictionary, when we look at what is trust, well, I'm always fascinated by the origins of words. And in fact, what we look at here is the word trust is actually originating from the Latin word fide or fid, F-I-D. And actually fid, and then not that I speak fluent Latin, Fidus was the Roman goddess of trust and faithfulness. And it was her responsibility to make sure that people could depend on other people. And as a result of that, what happens is we've taken Fidus and used it as the root of other words, because it means reliability between two parties, which is always reciprocal. And we could talk about the rule of reciprocity in more detail if we had more time, but what we want to focus on is that trust element. And since fid or fide means trust, it is the root word of many other familiar things, such as fiduciary. I mean, that relationship that we need with clients, and the old CAR acronym, the obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care, that most of us are familiar with, have seen so many times. But when we look at FID, it's also the root word of fidelity, which in a relationship of two people, making sure that they're faithful with each other and that there is no breach of the harmony or their relationship. When we look at fide or fid, in the words confide, to share a secret with a confidant, somebody who will not share that secret, or having that fiduciary duty of confidence where information is shared upon us and we have an obligation to hold that true and dear and not to share it with anybody else. In fact, the interesting thing about the fiduciary duty of confidence is that, you might want to make a note of this, information shared in confidence must be retained in confidence. Information shared in confidence must be retained in confidence. And then there's an important word after that: forever, even after the termination or the dissolution of that relationship. So if you work for a seller and they tell you about their motivations or willingness to come down on price, you can't share that with other parties. You need to keep that confidential. And if the listing were to expire and you entered into a new relationship with a buyer down the road and that property came back on the market with another agent, you can't share that information. And even though you have a duty of disclosure to your buyer client, you can only disclose what you're legally permitted to disclose. Just like we have obedience. If a seller tells you, I don't want certain people coming to my property, and they violate the protected classes under fair housing laws, you can't obey that. It's not a lawful instruction, and you can't divulge confidential information because that would be unlawful. So information gained in confidence must be retained in confidence forever, subject to a court subpoena or other legal process that might come into the place. Affidavit. Most of us are familiar with an affidavit, which is a written declaration or a statement asserting that the facts provided are true to the best of a person's knowledge, and is a sworn or affirmed before a person who has the authority to administer that oath, usually a notary or an officer of a court. And since the affidavit is a written equivalent to the sworn oath or testimony given in a courtroom, knowingly to include false information when signing it can be considered perjury. And in fact, we have in Standard of Practice 1-7 and 1-8 the ability to request an affidavit from a fellow realtor regarding the presentation of an offer or counteroffer. We also see the term bona fide, where bona fide is Latin for in good faith, meaning sincerity or to be genuine, with the emphasis on the absence of fraud or deception. We also even see fide or fid in the term Fido. People oftentimes name their dog Fido because they can trust in the loyalty of their dog. In fact, one of the probably the most famous dog named Fido was this yellow lab mixed mutt mongrel type dog back in the 1800s that was the pet dog of President Abraham Lincoln. Well, he was the pet of Abraham Lincoln before he became president, and President Lincoln decided to leave his dog behind in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, when he moved to Washington, D.C. to lead the country. And Fido is a very common term that we might call our dogs because, again, that understanding or relationship of that loyalty. So what is trust? Well, from the dictionary, it's a firm belief in the truth, reliability, understanding, and sincerity of someone or something, or to rely upon or place confidence in someone or something. It could either be a noun or a verb. And when we look at that noun definition, a firm belief in the truth, what we're looking at here is that that's a key word here, because not too far away in the dictionary, we've got trust, we've got trustful, we got trustworthy, and then we follow up with the word truth, because that is part of the definition, but they're almost back to back in the dictionary. So when we look at the word trust, we actually can just change a couple of letters here, and all of a sudden it becomes truth as part of the need to build trust. So if we're going to build trust, it's kind of a sequential series of steps. And we're going to look at 5 steps in particular in terms of how to build trust with a buyer, because this is where we need to have that relationship and that agreement. And so we're going to use the word trust, and we're going to break it apart so that it's literally components of a word, but it's now going to become an acronym. So we're going to use 5 words that begin with the letters T-R-U-S-T, and guess what? The very first one is going to be truth. Now, this is a special day. It's Valentine's Day. Some of you may have special curricular activities that you've got planned, some events that you're going to be participating in, and you might get dressed up. And oftentimes what might happen is somebody might ask, how do I look? And in fact, you had a great idea getting our picture professionally taken before a special night out. How do I look? And I apologize for the text not matching in the speech bubble there, so I'm going to read it so you can actually understand what these two people are talking about. And this is a very common question. When someone asks you how they look, here's some typical responses. You look beautiful. Simple and straightforward. Wow, you look so good in that outfit. What? Wait, huh? You mean they don't look good otherwise? They had to have on that special outfit? What you should do is just smile at them and tell them they look perfect. You could say, you look so hot. With you next to me, I'll probably get that fill in the blank. The job, the assignment, or the promotion. Folks, it's not about you. It's about them. They asked how they look. So you might respond with, I could see you on the red carpet being photographed by everyone. Now, in this particular case, we've got a gentleman here who didn't use, well, he didn't think about what he was going to say. He said, let me think about this for just a moment. I want to get some idea of using the right words. So he says, that's a beautiful dress for dinner tonight. Stunning. But I wouldn't want to be at a wedding with you wearing that dress. Now, some of you may know or be familiar with the concept of wearing a red dress at a wedding. If you're not familiar with it, just Google it. Type in the words, wear a red dress to a wedding, and see what it means. We're not going to discuss it here, but obviously, if he's erred in his judgment, he's being honest. But that's different from being truthful. And they're similar, but they have key distinctions here. So if he actually kind of decides that, well, wait a minute, what I mean is I think you would look incredible no matter where you wore that dress. It's kind of like words out of a shaving cream can or a tube of toothpaste. I mean, if you squeeze that tube of toothpaste or that can of shaving cream, you put it on a plate or on your face, good luck putting it back in the can. And when the words have come out of your mouth, good luck putting them back in your mouth. So he asked her, so are you mad at me for just being honest with you? Her response is, very simply, if I was, well, she's not saying this, she's thinking this. If I was honest with you, I'd tell you that I'd like to tie you to my truck and drag your sorry butt across the parking lot. But, you know, some people just don't say the right things. So actually what she did say is, I could never get mad at you. It's time for us to go move on and go out to dinner. And his response is, I think that's a really good idea. So what we want to do is kind of move on here by reminding ourselves. We need to tell buyers what they need to know, not just what they want to hear or know. And oftentimes it can be uncomfortable telling somebody the truth, but we need to do that, no matter how difficult. Well, no matter what may happen to the relationship. But that's how we build trust, by telling the truth. Then we get to the R. They need to be able to rely on us. Reliability is a cornerstone, a foundation, a building block, a step to building trust with people. It's kind of like the unbroken chain that bonds people together, where they can, well, have that reliability in that you're going to do the things that they expect you to do. When we look at the word reliability and we go to the dictionary, it's the quality of being trustworthy or of performing consistently well. But it's broken down into three components here. So I dissect everything, did the research, broken it all down, and have brought it to you here today. So our first subcomponent of reliability is dependability. In fact, this is the story of Billy T, because we got reliability, dependability, and we got two more Billy T's that are out there. But what's dependability? Well, it's more of a time element. How well have you performed in the past with others? And this is where you might provide testimonials, referrals, and the opportunity to build on that relationship based on how you've done things in the past. Then somebody might look at your reliability based on your durability. And what is that? Well, how well are you going to perform in the future? Are you going to break down? Are you going to have the stamina? Oftentimes in a challenging market, I've had to tell people about the two P's, especially buyers. I will be patient if you will persevere, and I will persevere if you will be patient, because it's a challenging market. And so that's about future activities and performance. And then we have our last ability, availability. Are you available? And what that means is at the present time, when somebody goes to contact you, wants to see a house, wants to do some follow-up, needs a question answered, are you available? And if you're not available, then they might not see you as being reliable. Now, one of the things that we have to be very cautious of, if we tell people we're available 24/7, then you have no right to get upset when somebody calls you at 11 o'clock at night because you told them you were available 24/7. So sometimes we need to set boundaries or guidelines in terms of what that availability is. So we go with these steps here. We've discussed truth. We've discussed reliability. And what we need to do is reliability is basically do what you said you would or will do. If you told somebody you would call them tomorrow, but it was subject to you getting an update from the lender, the appraiser, the inspector, the attorney, but you never got that update, and then you just didn't follow up with your client and share that information because you don't have any information to share. If you told them you'd call them, you need to call them, follow up with them. And if nothing else, tell them, I'm sorry, I don't have any new information, but I told you I would contact you. So do what you said you would do or will do. It's that simple. When we go to trust, our third step is understanding, or the U. And understanding deals with a variety of various components: to comprehend something, to know the meaning of or to have knowledge about, to know how something works or happens, or to know how someone thinks, feels, or behaves. And in fact, this can get very emotional, and buying a home is a very emotional process. And so we have to deal with people's emotions, how they think, how they feel, how they behave. It's almost an empathetic approach where you have to put yourself in their position or their perspective to get that understanding. In fact, understanding is a huge challenge that we have, that if you'll do me a favor, if you've got a piece of paper floating around, just anybody's got a piece of paper, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pick up the piece of paper with your eyes closed. So it's not like I'm going to be able to walk around the room. We're all virtual. Everybody's in a safe place, but I want everybody to close their eyes for just a moment while they're holding onto the piece of paper. Now, what I want you to do, and everybody's got their eyes closed, we need some trust here. Nothing's going to happen. Take the piece of paper and hold it up in front of your face. It's in front of the camera. Nobody can see it because everybody's eyes are closed. If you don't have it, that's fine. If you're doing this at home, follow along. And what I'd like you to do is fold it in half. Now, one of the things I'd like to do is, as everybody's folding their piece of paper in half, is keep holding it up and now fold it in half one more time again. And while you've got that piece of paper being held up with your eyes closed, what I'd like you to do is tear off the lower right-hand corner. Just tear off the lower right-hand corner. Now, what I'd like everybody to do after, I know some of you didn't work out this morning and having a challenge here tearing off that corner. But what I'd like you to do now is, keeping your eyes closed, is hold that piece of paper up in front of the camera. Now open up your eyes after everybody's got their piece of paper up and look at what everybody else has done. And what you're going to find is some people will have holes in their piece of paper like this. Some people will have the corners torn off. Everybody might have a different perspective, and you can go through the various, we got 5 pages of students on here. You can look at everybody's examples, but here's what happened. I gave everybody the same set of instructions, but we got different results because there was a difference in your understanding. Because maybe there wasn't clarity in the instructions. I said fold it in half. Did I say vertical or horizontal? No. But you made an assumption. When I said fold it in half again, did it mean in the same direction or the opposite direction? And then when you tore the corner off, I got more specific, but that's what resulted in different results. And so what happens is, anytime we talk with a buyer, could they get different results? Could they truly, we give them an agency disclosure form. Do they understand it? There's a big difference between understanding and knowledge. Yes, they told me about it. They shared it with me, but I didn't understand it. People sign documents all the time. Do they understand what they were signing? When we look at sincerity, the next step here, the S. Sincerity is the quality of being open and truthful. Now what we're going to find is that some of these elements, these steps, kind of overlap a little bit, where sincerity deals with truthfulness, our first step. And actually, sincerity is more about what you don't do. It's not about being deceitful or hypocritical. It's about being genuine. Now, there's not much more to describe there. So we're going to move on to our next T, which stands for transparency. This is a popular key term of the 21st century in terms of how people approach their business. And it means that you're being open, that you're being honest, that you're not hiding anything. And the challenge that we have is that because of the openness of the internet, everybody expects to have access to everything. And so it's a business decision for people to be more transparent. You're going to hear that term from politicians, from business leaders, from government officials. Watch for it in the news. Listen to it as people talk about it. Transparency is like the hot new word, even though it's not that hot. It's been around long enough. But how are we doing in the realtor community in terms of being transparent? That's one of the challenges of why there have been so many lawsuits, is because of the lack of transparency in the conversation about compensation. Now, that's a class in itself, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss that down the road. But right now, what we want to move on are these steps: truth, reliability, understanding, the first 3 steps that we have here. And then as we continue up that pace, we look at understanding, sincerity, and transparency, the 5 key areas, and hopefully you can remember these down the road when you're working with a buyer. Because like I said, they're pieces of a puzzle and they all kind of interconnect and interlock with each other, but you got to have them all. Very much like in a well-oiled machine with gears or cogs that are turning. We start with truth, reliability, understanding, sincerity, transparency. And in fact, if we have a situation where we're involved with reliability, understanding, and sincerity, there is one area that somebody could fall down. And that would be understanding, because that requires an acknowledgement on the other party's part that we know what the heck we're talking about. So in terms of what we're talking about, if I moved on to tell you a story, once upon a time, there was a lawyer known as Bernie Super Attorney. He was representing a music store in a lawsuit against a customer known as piano returner Betsy. Her husband Brian left her a lot of money when he died unexpectedly, and she did not know about his wealth. She referred to it in the probate proceedings as the Brian Trust Eye Opener. Some nefarious people overseas wanted to scam her out of her recent windfall. She was familiar with stories of Nigerian residents trying to con people, but the emails she was receiving were all coming from the small Southeastern Asia country of Brunei on the island of Borneo. She was sent cards, letters, and even Eastern Brunei poetry. Suspecting something illegal was going on and not wanting to classify anyone as a Bruneian stereotype, Betsy contacted her church for assistance, where she was told that there was a nearby priest en route. Betsy had mentioned that she may not be at home when the priest arrived, so he was free to use the lockbox she had on her front door. The priest showed up a little bit earlier than expected and tried to use the lockbox exactly as instructed on the web, as he considered himself a super internet obeyer. He didn't want to do anything wrong there. Some neighbors were watching and came over to inquire as to what was going on. The two women thought the priest might be a porch pirate. He asked them if they've ever had an experience of thefts of delivered packages, but one of them replied she didn't shop online. She was the prettier eBay non-user. The other woman indicated she traveled a lot as a USA ebony interpreter and was often out of town. In fact, she had a local teenager take care of her yard work and gardening when she was out of town. The kid was quite a Star Trek fan. It was known around town and in the neighborhood as the Enterprise Nature Boy. So, while there seems to be a lot of unrelated information in this story, there is one thing in common. And hopefully we can all understand this when I explain it to you. But if you take all of those statements in quotes that are in red, there's 10 of them there. They all have the same letters. They're just mixed around. In fact, the letters that are used in every one of those red phrases there are the same letters that are used in the words buyer representation. And while that may not mean much to you, buyer representation is like trust. It's built on a series of steps or letters or building blocks. And in this particular case, we're looking at A, B, C, D as the common building blocks, but we're going to look at them in terms of how they relate to buyer representation. We're going to look at the A, B, C, D of buyer representation. Boy, I wish I had more time than 1 hour, because I could certainly spend a lot of time, an hour just on the A's. I could spend another hour on just the B's, and I can certainly go beyond the C's and the D's. But if we focus on just the A for right now, what we have is in the description of agency, we've got a lot of A words. Agency is an arrangement between a principal that appoints an agent who agrees to represent the principal in select affairs authorized by the principal. Now, you may have heard that definition in different words and different terminology, but essentially it's an arrangement where somebody delegates or appoints somebody to represent them. That person is known as an agent, and they have to agree to this. And then they're limited in what they can do. Real estate agents are what we call special agents. They're not general or universal agents. We can't sign on behalf of a client. We can't make decisions. And in fact, that's a good word that we need to cover when we get to the D's, is decisions. But right now we want to focus on the A words here. And out of those A words, agency, arrangement, appoints, agent, agrees, affairs, authorized, the one key word there is agreement. And that's the word that we want to walk away from our session today, is remembering. Buyer representation is all about the agreement. And the agreement details the roles and responsibilities between a principal and an agent. And such agreements are covered in Article 9 of the Code of Ethics. Now, if we go to the Code of Ethics and read it together, realtors, for the protection of all parties, shall assure whenever possible that all agreements related to real estate transactions, including but not limited to listing and representation agreements, purchase contracts and leases are in writing, in clear and understandable language expressing the specific terms, conditions, obligations, and commitments of the parties, with a copy of each agreement being furnished to each party upon their signing or initialing. Not the day after, not when you go back to email it to them. Maybe that's something that needs to be addressed, but it says upon their signing or initialing. Now, fortunately, with electronic signatures, it is immediate. But let's focus on this concept that representation agreements are to be in writing whenever possible. And folks, if somebody were to ever charge you with a violation of Article 9, and the ethics police came in and looked at your file and said, clearly, you're representing the buyer, you have a New York State DOS agency disclosure form where the buyer agrees, and you've declared that you're representing the buyer's best interest as a buyer's agent. Well, if you have that acknowledgement on the form and there's evidence that you actually are representing the buyer, why don't you have an agreement to that effect? You probably have one for every seller and for every listing of a property in your marketplace that you've taken, but where are your buyer representation agreements? And so I don't want any of us to walk away thinking, oh, we're unethical, but you could be charged and you could be found in violation of Article 9 if you in fact do not have that agreement. So one of the things that we see is not just the need for representation agreements to be in our files should the ethics police start rummaging through them, unlike the DOS who can audit your files. We also have that key word understandable. Understandable is an important concept that we discussed in the middle step of building trust, so that they understand the rights, the obligations, the terms, the conditions, the commitments of all the parties that are involved. So we're going to move on here to the B word here. And the B word is benefits. And when we look at benefits, we're talking about the profile of home buyers and home sellers. And the profile of home buyers and home sellers is a survey that NAR has undertaken every year since 1981, the very same year I started my real estate career. And I remember getting my hands on the very first edition and recognizing that it changed my career. And subsequent to that, I wait in line, or I go online now every November to get my hands on the latest copy so that I can actually have a good understanding of how buyers and sellers think and operate, what they're looking for in a realtor, what benefits that they might need. So in Exhibit 4-10, NAR has uncovered the top 10 benefits that a buyer expects from their agent. And if you know what those benefits are, you're better positioned to provide them and be more professional and be more trusting. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go through the top 6. Survey says, what's the 6th most important thing a buyer expects from you as a benefit? To negotiate a better price. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, wait a minute, that's what I do on a regular basis. But there's 5 more important things your buyer wants from you other than negotiating the price. And what are they? Second one, number 5, improved knowledge of search areas, especially first-time home buyers and relocating buyers who are not familiar with the area. You're the neighborhood expert. You know the community. You're basically an undocumented ambassador of your Chamber of Commerce. People need to rely on you. And that's part of your promotion and marketing yourself is as an expert and knowledgeable on your local community, not just about real estate. And a lot of people might say, well, wait a minute, why would I want to do that? Because it's the 5th most important benefit the buyer wants from you. Because oftentimes, like I said, first-time home buyers, relocating buyers, they don't know the market. They don't know the area. Number 4, they want you to negotiate better terms. That's even more important than price, because price is typically something that they're going to pay to their mortgage company through monthly payments. So they want better terms, a lower interest rate, closing costs being paid, certain items to convey with the property, closing date, whatever it is. But if you'll see, 2 out of the 3 that we've already talked about deal with negotiation. And that's an element that a lot of us lack expertise in, or even familiarity, because it's not taught to us in our sales licensing course. It's ironic. The 77-hour salesperson's course to qualify for your license has no hours on negotiation, no hours on selling. And yet those are the 2 things that require us to be successful. So what's the third most important thing buyers want from us? Provide a better list of service providers. They want recommendations. They want referrals. They want you to tell them who to go to. And I know some of you are balancing that against the liability of, well, what if I'm liable for giving them a bad name? Well, then don't give them bad names. I've had people that I've had on my list of recommendations that I've had to take off the list because they haven't performed. I couldn't trust them. I couldn't depend on them. Number 2, point out unnoticed features or faults. They're not expecting you to be an engineer, a surveyor, a licensed home inspector. However, you have shown houses before. You know what to look for. And you may want to point them out. But in the past, you might have been concerned that, well, maybe it might result in them not buying the house. It doesn't matter. Your goal is for them to buy a house through you. Any house, not necessarily the house that you're showing them. And so they want that from their buyer's agent. And the number one benefit that every buyer wants, they want to have a better understanding of the process. Oh, we're back to the word understand. The critical middle step of building trust. But now it's about the process. Help the buyer understand the process. Now, the course that I'm teaching, Buyers Find Them, Bind Them, and Mind Them, we spend considerable time going over the process so that you can explain it in as little as 5 words to a home buyer. And so I'd love to see everybody in the ballroom at GSAR and have you learn how to explain the process, because it works like you wouldn't believe once you found out how to deliver that message. So that information about those benefits came out of Exhibit 4-10, where these were the benefits that were provided. And let's focus on that word benefits again in just a moment, but let's go on to our C word here. And our C word is commission cost. Now, the interesting thing about commissions is this. The Department of State has issued a legal memorandum, LI-10. LI stands for licensing. And it is referring to the definition of when a broker is due their commission. And what's interesting is if you read this legal memorandum straight from the Department of State, it says when listing their home with a real estate broker, few sellers take the time to carefully read and possibly negotiate the terms of their listing agreement with their broker. Now, specifically, it talks about sellers, but if sellers don't even read, what do you think buyers are doing? They're probably not aware, and so they're not knowledgeable. And if they're not knowledgeable, how could they be in a position of understanding? The Department of State goes on to say, the listing agreement sets forth not only the duties and the responsibilities of the broker owed to the seller, it establishes the duties and responsibilities the seller owes to the broker, particularly with respect to if and when the broker has earned his or her brokerage commission. This is the best part, folks. It's the next one. The listing agreement is a long sentence. The listing agreement defines the relationship between the real estate broker and the seller and establishes the point at which the broker is deemed to have earned its commission. Quote, although a broker is generally entitled to a commission when he produces a buyer ready, willing, and able to purchase the subject property on terms acceptable to the seller, the broker's right to a commission may be varied by an agreement. Now we're back to the A word. The agreement spells out how and when you're going to get paid. But let's look at the legal concept. The broker's generally entitled to a commission when they produce a buyer ready, willing, and able to purchase the subject property on terms acceptable to the seller. So I'm going to ask this question. How do you handle a seller's reluctance to pay when the broker is entitled to compensation? Because they're entitled at the meeting of the minds. You get a buyer and a seller into a contract. It meets the terms of the seller. The buyer's paying cash or has been pre-approved. They're able, they're willing. The parties are ready. Seller, pay my broker. We need a check from you right now. I don't know about you, but there's very few brokers that actually get paid at the meeting of the minds. Why? Because the sellers don't want to pay. Yeah, we're talking about sellers who don't want to pay. And so what do? We tell the seller, this transaction can accommodate your situation. It'll be taken out of the proceeds at closing. Which then begs this question. How do you handle a buyer's reluctance to pay when the broker's entitled to compensation? Because when you find the buyer a house, the same sentiment prevails. You're entitled to your commission at the meeting of the minds when you take your ready, willing, and able buyer client and find them the proper house. Unfortunately, the conversation never even takes place because most people don't ask their buyer to pay them at the time of the meeting of the minds. What we typically do is, if we have a conversation, we tell them the transaction can accommodate your situation, just like we tell the sellers. And as a buyer's broker or a buyer representative, a buyer agent, you can be paid by the seller, you can be paid by the buyer, you can be paid by the listing broker, but most of us are paid out of the transaction, and the pooling of the money oftentimes is difficult to identify its actual source. The seller's response oftentimes is, well, I'll pay when the buyer brings the money to the closing table. I don't have the money now. And so we can have conversations in more detail when we have more time. But right now, what we want to ask ourselves is another question here. And what is this question? And it's a heartfelt question that might be difficult to ask yourself. Is it the sellers do not want to pay you? Or is it the sellers do not want you to get paid? There's a big difference there in just in terms of laying those words out. And if we put it on the other side of the transaction, is it that buyers do not want to pay you? Or is it simply that buyers don't want you to get paid at all? Is that why we see so much litigation, complaints, publicity? Well, it's not about the money, folks. It's about the...
Buyer representation agreements are a win-win proposition for both real estate professionals and consumers. They assist in building trust and a mutually beneficial relationship by promoting transparency through upfront conversations and provide clarity regarding services consumers can expect to receive, as well as how the real estate professional will be compensated. This transparent practice is crucial for consumer education during one of the biggest and most complex transactions many make in their lifetime. A buyer representation agreement is a legally binding agreement that details many crucial elements of the relationship, such as services, agency relationship, and compensation. Signing one at the outset of the relationship protects both the broker and the buyer by avoiding misunderstandings. When meeting with a buyer who may be unfamiliar with buyer representation agreements, be prepared to articulate the many benefits of these agreements, such as how they ensure the client has a loyal advocate representing them in the transaction, provide clarity on the services a consumer should expect from their agent, and how the consumer can partner with the agent to conclude a successful transaction. Understand the agent's representation and duties owed to the consumer, including whether the agent may be serving as a dual agent. And allow consumers an opportunity to ask questions about how their real estate professional is being compensated, including who is responsible for the payment for their services. For resources to help facilitate these important conversations during a buyer representation meeting, including articulating your value and explaining how compensation works, check out competition.realtor for infographics, informative articles, and more.
I apologize for the video not being available there, only the audio, but that was a legal representative, an attorney with NAR, describing the importance of buyer representation agreements, the benefits that you provide, and the value that you also bring to the table. When we look at that equation, V equals B compared to C, what we're talking about is value equals benefits, our B, compared to the cost. In fact, when we look at a seller, it's very easy for a seller on a listing presentation to ask, what is your commission? What is your fee? And then they're going to compare to the benefits to determine the value. This is why some brokers can charge more than others. This is why some brokers charge less than others. That's why the commissions are negotiable, because there's a comparison of that cost to the benefits that are being provided. Buyers, on the other hand, don't have that luxury oftentimes of seeing that astute distinction, because the benefits that are often provided are so similar with a buyer's agent. We show them a house and we sell it to them. And the cost out of their pocket oftentimes is nothing. And so it's very difficult for them to calculate that value. And so this is one of the things, again, we'll focus on in the additional class. But this formula of benefits compared to cost to determine value is probably the single most important thing that you can take away from today, because it is the future of our success. When we look at our next step here, the D, we're talking about not 3D, but 4D. The very first thing is you need to disclose. That's about being truthful. Tell them everything that they need to know. Be honest with them. Be truthful with them. Disclose. Have that discussion about compensation. Have the discussion about representation. Have discussion about the home buying process that they don't so dearly want to understand. Then, after you've had that conversation, make a decision. Is this somebody that you want to represent? You don't have to represent everybody, just like you don't have to take on every listing. If you've got an unmotivated, unrealistic seller, you may have a similar situation when trying to represent a buyer that's unqualified, unmotivated. So you make that decision. And then document everything. Put it in writing. And one of the things that we're recognizing now is it not just is good business practice. It may be something that you need to defend yourself when dragged into the courtroom. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is a lot of buyers being told by attorneys through advertisements, have you been involved in a car accident? Call this number. Have you been involved in drinking water at Camp Lejeune? Have you been exposed to asbestos? Did you buy a house and use a buyer's agent, of which you were unable to negotiate your commission? Were you even aware of your commission? And so one of the things that we have to do is recognize that we need this fifth D, determine if you're willing to raise the bar on buyer representation by building trust, not disgust. Now, I've got one more thing here. My name is Randy Templeman. I love the letter C here, but I'm going to use the letter C because it reminds me of another word, kind of a bonus word here, and that is a cane. A cane is used to help someone take a step, to walk or move forward. And that's what we need to be able to do. They're not going to be able to raise the bar here. They just need to be able to take a step. But cane is an acronym to help you remember your role as a buyer's representative. And it could be a dialogue that you could use. You could take the script, you can borrow it, you can use it, you can plagiarize it. You just can't copyright it. But one of the things that it is 4 key components of what your role is. As your buyer's agent, I will communicate with you, the C, advocate for you, the A, negotiate for you, the N, and educate you on all the steps involved. And you might have come into this class thinking, why would I need to educate them? But now you should understand that this is the #1 benefit they want from their realtor. So telling them that you'll help them, educate them on the process is something that they love. So you want to communicate, advocate, negotiate, and educate in return for someone agreeing to compensate your efforts. You got to have that conversation. You could simply say, without using this Cain approach, I make a living helping people in real estate transactions. I make a living helping people solve their real estate problems or dilemmas. I make a living finding solutions or strategies to getting people through their pain or problems or issues in real estate matters. But you can simply say, I sell real estate and I earn my living that way. You simply ask for permission. Is it all right if I get paid for doing that? I've been doing this for years, months. You might not want to say weeks, but then that's a different conversation. And just ask for permission. Is it all right if I get paid for doing this work, for the time that I'm going to put forth to help you find that house? And in fact, when we look at that terminology, find that house, that's another word we may or may not want to use as an acronym, clean. So we're going to clean things up here and remind ourselves of those 4 terms in Cain: communicate, advocate, negotiate, and educate. But we're going to add a different word in here. And it's the 8 words: communicate, educate, advocate, negotiate. What about locate? Do you locate properties? There was a time before 1996 when the realtor was responsible for sitting down with the buyer, having a discussion about what type of property they were looking for. That needs analysis. And then looking it up in the MLS to find matches and bringing them together. Take the buyer to the properties. Now, one of the things that's happened recently over the last quarter of a century plus is that buyers have been introduced to other tools and resources to help them find properties. They don't need us to locate the property. In fact, if I were to ask you to write down the names of your last 5 buyers that closed on a transaction, oh, wait a minute, I wouldn't want to embarrass you by having you fail to remember your buyers' names. But if I asked you to write down the addresses of the 5 last transactions that you had, the addresses of the properties that people bought, that might be easier for you, but that's not the test here. The test is, of those 5 properties, how many of them did the buyer tell you about versus you found the house for the buyer? Who's doing the locating? Now, if you're doing this and it's part of your value that you bring, then use the CLEAN acronym. If you don't really work hard at helping people locate properties, you're just a showing service, then you might want to work on the CAIN and help them through step by step. In fact, when we take steps, oftentimes we see something that will get us up to another level or another floor called the escalator. Now, the escalator, by its definition, escalate means to increase or to be increased in extent, intensity, or magnitude, or to go up. Many of you are familiar with, in a hot market, something called the escalation clause. Love it, hate it, it exists. And it's triggered by the presence of a competing offer to result in an increase of the offering price by a percentage, a dollar amount. There could be a cap, there could be a requirement for evidence or proof. We're not going to get into that. Just want to make you familiar with the fact that it does occur out there. But I need you to be aware of something else that also occurs. And every one of you are aware of this. In a multiple offer situation, you may be informed or instructed as a buyer's representative
Randy, I think
we
your
just lost
sound
Randy.
just went.
I'm back right in the middle. My holdout here. We're just about done here. Let me see if I can get us back to where we were. I'm not sure what happened. The glitches and the tech people out there. So, okay. So we got a situation where we've got multiple offers, buyers competing against each other. Oftentimes the instruction from a listing broker is have your buyers respond with their highest and best offer. In that particular case, some buyers may do that. But what do other buyers oftentimes do? They might tell you, I'm not getting into a bidding war. And so they step out of the negotiations. But what might happen is there's one buyer, your buyer, that steps up to the plate, increasing their offer over their original offer. Now, in this particular case, they've just picked a number, but it's much higher than their original offer. It's their best offer. It's a firm and final offer, whatever you want to phrase it or call it. But we're now going to go back to this, oh, an escalator can also go down. I'm not sure why we would call it a down escalator, because isn't that kind of oxymoronic? An escalator is supposed to go up. So if you're going down, what is that called? It's called a regression. And regress is a movement backward to a previous and typically worse state or condition. So what ends up happening is, can a buyer make their offer contingent or subject to anything? And the answer is absolutely. Your buyers this weekend could make their offer contingent upon Syracuse being the snow capital of upstate New York this year. They could make an offer subject to it hitting 60 degrees in the month of February. They can do anything they want. They can make an offer subject to the presence of another offer and escalating up to a certain new amount, or they can do this. They could have a regression clause in there that's triggered by the absence of a competing offer. Everybody else bailed out, but now your buyers come in with their best offer and it's higher and there's no other offers. They're going to overpay for the property. And what are you doing to protect them from paying too much for the house? If you're not offering your buyers that opportunity to implement a regression clause and it's their decision, then that might be a dereliction of duty in your representation. And so one of the things that we oftentimes have to do is recognize that being a buyer representative is more than just calling ourselves a buyer representative. It's about getting the training and the education necessary to be able to do that. So I hope that I'm able to see you at some point down the road in a class that I'm having the privilege of being in front of you, sharing information, whether it be from NAR with the Accredited Buyer Representative Designation course, one of my own courses, or something that I might see in just a conversation on the street that we have. So I want to thank everybody for being here today.